Values in retreat? Is the resurgence of transactional foreign policy hindering the prevention of mass atrocities, the promotion of the rule of law, and the global response to COVID-19? From Budapest, once again, I'm Ben Witorsh, Holbrook Fellow at the Shattuck Center on Conflict, Negotiation, and Recovery at Central European University School of Public Policy. Each year, the Shattuck Center hosts the Lemkin Reunion, a gathering established in 2014 with the generous support of an anonymous donor. The reunion is named in honor of Raphael Lemkin, the Polish lawyer who, having lost most of his family in the Holocaust, coined the term genocide and campaigned tirelessly throughout his life to have it codified as an international crime. The previous 4 sessions have been extremely interesting. To recap, we discussed transactional foreign policy within the context of the international system, the prevention of and accountability for mass atrocities, democratic backsliding, and international security. Now we turn to the first global challenge of this decade, one that presents a clear and present danger, and one that did not exist when we developed the concept for this event last fall. COVID-19, however, is the reason that we're doing this event online and in July, as opposed to in April when we originally planned. The global pandemic is also extremely relevant to the theme of this event, even before we added it to the title. Transactionalism has absolutely factored into the crisis. To varying degrees, some governments have approached the pandemic as an opportunity to seek individual advantage at the expense of the broader international community. Others, perhaps out of habit, have continued in their transactional ways, and one could argue that it has hurt their individual response. It has become abundantly clear, however, that in our interconnected world, one which we hope to maintain, this disease knows no borders, and defeating it requires a cooperative global response, not transactionalism. So could this crisis be the event that reminds the world that consensus and adherence to established norms are a necessity as opposed to a luxury? Our panel today includes a diverse group of experts who will look at both sides of the discussion. The first 2 presenters will talk about instances or examples or alleged examples of transactionalism in the wake of the crisis. The second 2 will talk both about the need for cooperation and how that might take shape. One technical note for today's session: please submit your questions using the link to menti.com and the instructions just below the video screen. And now I'd like to introduce our panel chair. Valerie Hopkins is Southeast Europe correspondent for the Financial Times. And I'll just say that her reporting should be a required reading for anybody following Central Europe and the Balkans. Before joining FT, Valerie reported for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, another outstanding publication, and her reports have appeared in a long list of influential news outlets. She holds a master's in journalism from Columbia University and received her bachelor's from the College of William and Mary in my home state of Virginia. Over to you, Valerie.
Thank you so much. What a serious introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you very much for having me on this very interesting panel. I'm looking forward to learning quite a lot. And I'm really excited that we have such a diverse range of expertise in public health, global policy, the role of China in the world, and development cooperation. So I'm not an expert at any of those things, and I would like to get the panel underway without further ado. As Ben said, we have about 45 minutes for presentations, and then we will be opening it up to a Q&A that I'm looking forward to facilitating. So I would like to introduce the first speaker. That is Sina Zekavat, who is a social justice researcher and writer and a member of the Alliance of MENA Socialists. And Mr. Zekavat will speak about public health as a political weapon. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Is everyone hearing me perfect? Everybody hearing me? Do you hear me? Everyone? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that everyone's hearing. Thank you. Yes, the topic of my talk is based on a long article that I wrote on the Open Democracy website while the initial stages of the coronavirus viral what's happening. I'm from Iran originally and have been active against the US sanctions and militarism, and also against internal oppression of the Iranian state inside the country. So this falls under my kind of long-term activism, this kind of analysis that I wrote. So as the coronavirus hit the country Iran, which was mainly due to the scale of the death that is still ongoing and it keeps getting worse, is actually really the fault of mainly fault of the Iranian regime's own, I don't use the word mismanagement anymore because it's very problematic, its own systematic failure to handle the crisis, and also it has been contributing to it by deliberately making very bad decisions. So US started to impose new round of sanctions actually in the midst of this corona crisis, which was condemned and criticized by many different countries. And it became a kind of another moment of propaganda exchange between the Iranian and American regime. I call both of them regimes. I don't distinguish between the two. And then Iran was blaming the US for creating a humanitarian, kind of a health crisis in Iran, and the US was saying, oh, the sanctions are exempt from humanitarian goods, so there should be no issue. So it's the very usual exchange that happens very regularly on the mainstream media. They keep blaming each other. While people are suffering, nobody does anything. So I decided to write this article to go in depth of what the issue of sanctions are in Iran and also in the Middle East. The US imposed the toughest round of sanctions actually not during the Trump administration, but during the Obama administration. And this was before the beginning of the nuclear negotiations. This was an instrument for the Obama administration to bring Iran to the so-called negotiation table that was their goal, to bring Iran to the negotiation table by imposing the toughest sanctions, as Obama referred to it himself. So it's not new. The toughest sanctions have been imposed since the Obama administration. At the report of the health crisis, the impact of sanctions on the health infrastructure of the country, on medicine especially, has been coming out of Iran since the time of Obama administration. So again, this is nothing new, that sanctions have been affecting Iran's health crisis. However, the Iranian government itself also denied the initial impact of sanctions till very later, until 2-3 years ago, that they started to admit that the sanctions are affecting the country's health crisis. And then this is when they started to use it actually as a humanitarian bargain chip against the West, saying it's economic terrorism, you're affecting our health crisis. But at the same time, Iranian government itself has been privatizing the health sector, taking money and resources away from the nation's wealth and putting it into wars and militarism in the region. So the issue is not just one sanctions, but it's actually sanctions together with local military regimes like Iran, which they are not willing to, or are not even interested or capable to care about their own citizens. So the issue is not just the economic sanctions, but also the local military regimes like Iran or like Assad regime, which they refuse to even care for their own citizens. Like they're bombing their own citizens, they're killing their own citizens during protests, and they're cutting down on health and the health budget of the country, privatizing, putting it into militarism. Assad has been bombing hospitals in the country. So how can we claim that these states are willing or interested to care about people? And they later start to say the US, it's all the West's fault. And the propaganda exchange ongoing, and the general public is always lost in this exchange between the two sides. We don't know. Some people take one side, some people take the other side, which I think is both ineffective, because the problem is not about taking sides, it's all about addressing the systematic issues that are taking place on both sides. So then the role of EU, I want to address in this situation, and the UN in terms of the whole Middle East and the sanctions regime that has been, Iran is not the first country that has been sanctioned. To establish, led by Germany during the coronavirus, announced that they established something called the Instrument in Support of Trade Exchange with Iran, which is shortened as INSTEX. This basically turns the EU into a larger financial entity that Iran can deal with. So Iran is no longer dealing with banks or corporates for buying goods, but is dealing with the EU. So in that way, the US is not able to impose or restrict as it could limit a company or a bank. So the EU becomes the partner of the Iranian state to purchase goods. Which is, the problem is not about the purchasing of goods, but the problem is where these goods are going to be distributed. I mean, there are many reports came out during the corona pandemic that the Iranian regime is even selling goods that is purchasing triple the price, 4 times, 10 times the price into the market and making profit out of it. So this profit goes back again into the military industrial complex of Iran, which is run by the IRGC. It's in war in 4 different countries right now. It's in war in Syria. It's occupying Iraq. It's in war. It has influence in Afghanistan. So the profit that is generated from these goods events purchased by this so-called legal way is again pumped back into the military and violence and dictatorship apparatus. So again, purchasing of the goods is not the issue again. So then the EU started actually establish this system, and it's actually very similar to the system that the US before the US invasion of Iraq. The UN established a very similar mechanism, which was referred to as the Oil for Food program. Because of the harsh US sanctions, imperialist sanctions that was imposed on Iraq before the US invasion, we know that the healthcare system there was collapsing. So the UN established a Food for Oil program in order to bypass the US sanctions. But not only this didn't create a kind of a break or a kind of a support for health system in Iraq, it actually led to large scale of corruption in both sides, both on the side of the UN and the Iraqi Saddam regime. So we see that when the EU or the UN starts intervening in order to bypass these sanctions in the name of humanitarianism, it actually serves corruption, because these systems, these states are inherently corrupt and they don't care about their own citizens. So bypassing these sanctions is not going to solve the problem. The problem is where the resources are allocated. Are these states accountable for their own citizens, for the well-being of their own citizens? No, of course they're not, because they're bombing them, they're killing them, imprisoning them. So why would they suddenly care about these people in the middle of a crisis? So this is the kind of the propaganda exchanges taking place between the West and these non-Western regimes, Western regimes and non-Western regimes, like that we are getting caught up with, and we forget the actual priority, which is saving lives. It's actually very similar again to Syria. I'm using Iran, Iraq, Syria as an example. During the last 9 years of war, the UN has been, kind of keeping its relationship with the Assad regime, providing diplomatic and political benefits for the regime and also financial, while the regime has been bombing hospitals, has been limiting access of large portions of the country to safety. And again, we see that UN, in the name of sustaining its own humanitarian inflow into the country, refused to kind of put pressure on the Assad regime to bring it into political negotiations, because the solution is not just humanitarian, the solution is inherently political and social. So again, we see that in the case of Syria even, the UN has been, instead of improving people's situation, maybe they save some people in maybe regime-held areas. However, this is a very selective humanitarian intervention because it only serves people that are protected or living under the areas captured by the regime. The people outside of these areas, which is areas mostly devastated by the aerial bombardment of the Assad, Iran, and Russia, they remain disconnected from this flow of humanitarian aid. And they're used as the humanitarian aid becomes like a weapon in the hand of the regime, local Assad regime, in order to starve and to force populations into submission. So both the US and the EU act very irresponsibly, but this is not accidental. This is designed system. The sanctions are not designed. This is not a kind of a unwanted outcome of the sanctions. The sanctions are designed to be broad, to be vague, to be non-specific, in order to cripple the entire population, because it's a form of collective punishment. But when the US says the humanitarian aid or food is exempted from these sanctions, this is basically a kind of a propaganda that also the US government is playing just to save itself from criticism. But on the underground, these sanctions are actually affecting all sectors of the economy. One reason of that is because the local military regimes have influenced all sectors of the society in these countries. So it's impossible when you target one entity, the regime state, it's impossible that this entire society is not affected by it. So this is kind of a framing that I tried to engage in my article called "For US and Iran, Public Health is Political Weapon." Because there's a lot of kind of narratives or discourses that frame the situation as kind of unwanted or accidental or like a secondary effect of the sanctions. However, this is very systematically designed economic violence, not just by the US, but also by the local regimes, whether it's Iranian regime, Assad regime, or the Saddam, which was toppled by US invasion. They go hand in hand. The US sanctions actually help these local regimes, benefits them, they generate profit. New classes of elites emerge in these countries due to the sanctions because the economy becomes in the control of the state more. The state has more power over import, export, and who gets what. So this is when a new elite class even emerges out of these sanctions, and the regimes are never hurt or damaged by these sanctions. They find another way of generating their economy, the war economy, the dictatorship economy that they rely on to survive. And it's important to oppose these sanctions. And because in the case of Iran, we see that it's impossible to separate the targeted sanctions, the specific targeted sanctions, from the broad economic sanctions that affect the entire country. The Trump administration has been using this targeted sanctions more than Obama administration. However, the Trump administration has also been pushing or maximizing, in Trump's own words, Obama's legacy of already intensified sanctions. So the targeted sanctions don't really do anything. They're symbolic. They're ineffective. They're just there to serve the American facade of democratic intervention. In effect, is not doing that. It's just effect. In reality, it's not doing that. It's affecting the entire country. So the position of many progressives and people, activists from the MENA region against the sanctions is that the sanctions have to be resisted and said no. But at the same time, these regimes, local regimes, need to be put pressure on by the people. And this is when the people become very important, because people find a way to sustain their own life during the Corona crisis or during the war in Syria. But they're not given legitimacy or voice in the international world system, because they're not a legitimate state, because the international law is designed around the agency and the kind of sovereignty of the central state. So when local populations come up with their own ways of saving lives, creative, resilient, brave ways, not just during Corona or the war. For example, when those floods in Iran 2 years ago, taking 3/4 of the country, again, it was the local population that was the first people that they were coming up with emergency actions to save their own lives. It was not the state, it was not the Iranian state, and the delay of the Iranian state in providing aid or emergency help, it was not because of sanctions, as they claimed. It was because the state inherently doesn't care about the lives of its own citizens. It's just there to extract profit, money from the resources of the country and push it into regional wars. That's the only goal and focus of this regime. It's not to protect its own citizens. So local populations act with creativity, with resilience, with bravery. However, the central state starts to arrest activists and humanitarians and environmentalists, because the Iranian state doesn't want the world to see that the people are capable of running their own lives, and they can't do it, because then the world will see that the Iranian state is not what it's claiming, that it's the protector of its people. And then the funding that the Iranian state is taking for itself, extracting from the EU or the UN in the name of humanitarianism, it will be also questioned, saying if the people can protect their own lives, then what is the role of the Iranian state? So Iranian state puts all these activists, humanitarians and environmentalists again into prison for the crime of trying to protecting themselves and saving their own lives. So again, I just want to summarize my article and my analysis. It's not my analysis. I want to be clear here. This is an analysis of many people. This is what many Syrians are thinking. This is what many Iraqis have been trying to say. This is what Iranians are trying to say, that the sanctions regime of the imperial sanctions regime of the US are causing humanitarian and life economic crisis in this country. However, the local state, whether it is the Iranian state or the Assad regime or the Saddam regime, which was toppled, or the current regime also, in Iraq, these regimes don't care about their own citizens, because the region, this is the nature of the Middle East, because these states do not represent their own people. They're just there to extract money and wealth and resources for themselves, for their own military projects, for their own wars and occupations. So neither this nor that, neither Western imperial sanctions nor domestic authoritarian military regimes, which they're both attacking people's well-being, and safety and everything. This is when that narrative needs to shift, and the focus needs to be on the agency of the masses, of the population, of the revolting masses of the Syrian revolution. The Iranian people, which they protested in October, the last October, and between 300 and 1,500 people were killed in 5 days. So these are the people, the agency to save people's lives is in the hands of the region's population, not in the hand of the US or Europe or the UN or the local regions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sina. We can, there's a lot to talk about there, and there's a lot hopefully we can come back to in the Q&A for that. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you. Sorry if I went Yeah.
No, thank you. We're going to move on to the next presentation, which is switching gears a little bit to talk about the implications for the EU-Chinese relations. So I'd like to introduce Martin Hála, who is a sinologist, lecturer, and founder and director of Sinopsis.cz, a joint project between Acamedia and the Institute of East Asian Studies at Charles University in Prague. Mr. Hála studied in Prague, Shanghai, Berkeley, and Harvard, taught in Prague and Bratislava, and led projects in various countries throughout Asia. From 2014 to 15, he was the regional manager for Asia Pacific at the Open Society Foundation. Mr. Hála, the floor is yours. But you have to unmute yourself first.
Sorry about that.
Thanks.
So let me just thank you again for the nice introduction, and thanks for having me on the show. And I think I will start by stating the obvious that long before the pandemic even broke out, Europe had already been a hotly contested space in the unfolding competition, and by now I think we can say confrontation between the United States and the People's Republic of China. Historically, Europe had followed the US policy of engagement towards China since its inception in the 1980s, and then again after the short interruption of the Tiananmen events in the 1990s. Essentially, the US, when they changed their policy towards China, towards engagement in those years, they took the whole world with them, including Europe. Now, the United States have been changing that policy lately. First, gradually, since I would argue the second term of President Obama, and then, of course, very abruptly under the current administration. But this time, Europe has not really been following the United States so unanimously in this latest policy turn. Much of Europe still operates in the previous engagement mode. And this, of course, opens opportunities for the Communist Party of China and the People's Republic of China to exploit in their confrontation with the United States. And we might also add that Europe is a notoriously fractured political entities operating on the basis of consensus. So that opens still more opportunities for China to exploit. We should remember that tactical alliances with lesser enemies are the mainstay of the CCP's United Front approach. And accordingly, to outflank the growing United States pressure, Beijing has been seeking closer relationship with the European Union and Europe in general in yet another variation on the classic triangular balancing of power. And similarly, within Europe itself, China has employed the same triangular tactic by essentially offsetting Central and Eastern Europe against Western Europe through the 16+1 or now 17+1 arrangement. Now, the coronavirus crisis only made this basic situation more acute. Essentially, Beijing can ill afford a loss of faith that would dampen its ambition to lead the world towards the quote-unquote community of shared destiny for humankind, as they call their vision for the future arrangement of the international space. China's claim to global leadership basically rests on demonstrating that the Leninist one-party system can be more efficient in dealing with the world's problems than the decentralized chaos of democracies. The initial flop in China of censoring information rather than controlling the disease was not a good start, but then the resolute and sometimes draconian quarantine measures employed afterwards might help to restore the desired image. And most of all, the face mask diplomacy, which I consider to be the quintessential expression of transactional diplomacy, offered an opening again to change the epidemic narrative from PRC as the cause to PRC as the solution to the problem. Europe, as you all know, like most other regions, found itself in desperate shortage of protective gear, protective medical gear, when the pandemic reached its soil in March. And this was, of course, partly due to the fact that it was exactly this kind of gear that that had been sent from Europe to China when the epidemic peaked there in China in February, and Europe still felt relatively safe and untouched. Now, when the flow of the medical equipment reversed in March and started flowing from China to Europe, it was accompanied with a massive propaganda campaign, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. The face mask deliveries were presented as almost acts of mercy in some cases. And in some European cities, the cargo planes that brought these supplies were welcomed on the tarmac by the highest officials from the receiving countries in what I have described as a parody of a modern day cargo cult. More recently, these scenes also reminded me of the famous letter by the Chinese official Lin Zexu to Queen Victoria at the beginning of the Opium War in the mid-19th century, when he warned her that there is nothing that the Celestial Empire needs from the outside world, but the barbarians would die within days of constipation if they couldn't get the supplies of tea and rhubarb from China. Rhubarb was taken as digestive in those times. Now, in the Czech Republic, the face mask diplomacy brought back a group of politicians who were previously connected with another form of transactional diplomacy with China, which was dubbed at the time as economic diplomacy, and essentially consisted of closer relations with the People's Republic of China in exchange for the promise of large-scale investments in these countries. The investments never really materialized, and the whole concept of economic diplomacy collapsed, certainly in the Czech Republic, after the Chinese company that had been hailed as the flagship of the Chinese investment in the Czech Republic went bankrupt and turned out to be a huge financial fraud in 2018. And that pretty much discredited the group of Czech politicians who had been associated with it. But the coronavirus crisis and the face mask diplomacy in particular brought them back again. One of this group's public faces, the Czech Deputy Prime Minister, is on record advising other politicians that we need to be nice to the People's Republic of China. Otherwise, they might cut off the medical supplies and we would presumably all die, just like Victorian England would be decimated by constipation without the Chinese tea and rhubarb in the 19th century. We might conclude that the face mask diplomacy reinforced, at least for a while, the pro-Beijing groups throughout Europe, and in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. But it has also alienated quite a few people, including some top European Union officials. So all in all, it seems to have further divided public opinion towards the PRC in Europe. And only time will tell whether Beijing has once again overplayed their hand, or whether some of the, I would say, rather forced gratitude for the face masks will stick beyond the current crisis. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. There's a lot also to come back for, and I'm already getting some questions from the audience about the presentation, but we'll move now to Hans Dembowski, who is the editor-in-chief of the Development and Cooperation, DNC.EU, who's going to talk about only global cooperation can solve global problems, and that's true of COVID-19 too. Dr. Dembowski holds a PhD in development sociology from Bielefeld University. I have quite a long bio, but his book, Taking the State to Court, Public Interest Litigation and the Public Sphere in Metropolitan India, was published by Oxford University Press in 2001. And there's still a case pending about this book, which I think is very interesting. Maybe we can hear a bit more about that. But I'm just going to let you read the bio online and give the floor to Dr. Dembowski, please. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to start commenting that I really struggle to try to talk policy in regards to the Trump administration. What the Trump administration is doing often does not make very much sense. It's incoherent, it's often implausible, so I struggle to see the big design of things, and we just need someone halfway sane to take control again. But I'll try to get to my presentation. So the guiding thing that I miss in a lot of these debates is that it's a basic tenet of systems theory that if a system destroys its environment, the system destroys itself, because every system ultimately depends on the environment it lives in. We cannot exist without our environment. The environment can exist without us. If we destroy the environment, we're destroying ourselves. Now, if we consider humankind to be one single system, which at least in biological terms makes sense, then we notice that human civilization is actually destroying the natural environment that we depend on. It's climate change, it's the erosion of biodiversity, it's the depletion of ocean resources, and so on and on and on. We can't afford to do that. No single nation state can solve these problems. We need cooperation because it is something that concerns our entire species as a system. Now, if we look at the COVID-19 crisis, the same is true. No single nation is safe until all nations are safe, because if one nation develops a hotspot, then that will spread to others. Now, some right-wing populists like the idea of closing borders, but it's not a good solution because closing borders reduces opportunities for all
Sorry, I just want to, we're having a bit of a trouble. Is anyone else having trouble hearing?
We also need.
Can everybody else, is it just my internet or is there a problem?
I can move the microphone a bit.
Okay, thanks. Okay, keep going, let's see.
Okay, so I think we need to see COVID-19 as a double challenge. On the one hand, it's a health challenge, and secondly, it's an economic challenge. And on the health front, we need all countries to have enough preventive gear to keep the health staff alive so they can handle the patients. We need ICUs, we need medicines. Once the vaccine is there, we'll need the vaccines. We'll need to ensure that the health staff is safe first, and people who work at home, like me, probably will need the vaccine the last. Well, and it's crazy to think that we'll monopolize the resources for our country, and then the rest of the world can take care of itself. Well, the rest of the world will not take care of itself. We need to take care of the entire world system all the time. The same is true in regard to national economies. A national economy is just a subsystem of the global economy. If the global economy tanks, it's very hard for a national economy to stay strong. So we need some kind of policy response that works for everybody. And in this sense, we need global cooperation on the health aspects of COVID. We need global cooperation on the economic aspects of COVID, and we need cooperation on a lot of other global issues as well. Now we're going to fight international terrorism, but not at the international level. No country on its own can ensure global financial stability. Valerie, you don't hear me, do you?
No, I mean, sometimes there are pockets of where you sound fairly good, and now it's again breaking up. I'm wondering if we should go to Dr. Balfour and see if maybe you can reset your internet connection.
Okay.
Is that all right? Sorry, I just don't.
I don't think it'll. I can try.
Now you sound okay.
But I'm not
Why don't
sure
we
it'll
try
help
one
much.
more time, and then if it has to break up, we'll go to Rosa. Sorry about that.
Okay. So what I find interesting, we a lot of people say that globalization is about trade, and that's regulations that it's about the law, it's about international governance, global governance, and it is essential. We need global governance. And the big question is, why do right-wing populists deny this obvious truth, and how can they thrive on it? That would be what I'd like to elaborate on now, but it only makes sense if you can hear me. There seem to be difficulties.
We can hear you now, and if you can try and do that, because we're also running a bit behind our schedule. So yeah.
Okay, so the interesting thing is that populists from Donald Trump in the States to Boris Johnson in Britain, or Bolsonaro in Brazil and Modi in India, they're all seeming to have a particularly bad pandemic. The news from these countries is worse than it is from most EU members, and it's interesting to consider why. And I think one reason why is because these governments are not really interested in facts. They're not really interested in dealing with real-world problems. They're much more interested in pressing their ideological propaganda. And if that doesn't work, then they just keep repeating themselves. I remember well that Brexit was to lead to a global Britain, which would have a greater influence. It was striking that last week, The Economist, it was 2 weeks ago, The Economist had a cover dealing with global governance, and they had a leader, and then they had a full special report of 12 pages or so, and they didn't even mention any particular role for Britain. Britain did not figure in the whole section. In a paper that is produced in Britain, it would have been unimaginable for a global governance report in The Economist not to feature what Gordon Brown wants, or what Tony Blair thinks, or what what David Cameron intends to do. That would have always figured, but Johnson actually does not figure at the global level anymore. I think that's absolutely fascinating. The reputation of the U.S. is, I'd say it's collapsed. Who takes the White House seriously anymore? You can't. I mean, they're not making sense. Full stop. The response is, I don't take responsibility. Trump doesn't take responsibility for COVID-19 in the States. He doesn't take responsibility for wearing masks. He doesn't take responsibility for the WHO. He doesn't take responsibility at all. So, how do you want to deal with this? The interesting thing is, can we cooperate with the governors of states like California and New York at international?
Okay, sorry.
Politics with governments that don't make sense. Yeah.
Maybe we should leave it there so that because we are running behind. We're actually only 5 minutes from the supposed when we should begin our Q&A. So I'd like to hand it over to Rosa Balfour, if you don't mind, and maybe you can come back to some of your points during the Q&A. Rosa Balfour is the director of Carnegie Europe. Her fields of expertise include European politics, institutions, and foreign and security policy. Her current research focuses on the relationship between domestic politics and Europe's global role. Prior to joining Carnegie Europe, Balfour was a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She was also the director of the Europe in the World program at the European Policy Center in Brussels, and worked as a researcher in Rome and London. Rosa is going to talk to us about Europe's role in the post-COVID-19 world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be in this group discussing these issues from such a global perspective. I'm going to focus on Europe and what Europe can do and why it's important that Europe does this. And I think what has just been said about the need for global cooperation, well, as things, and what has just been said about the US and China as things stand, I think, you know, if the world wants to have a better chance of cooperating in the future, be it on the pandemic or on climate change, Europe is one of those actors that can play a role there. But in order to do that, Europe needs to do a few things, because even though as things stand today, the pandemic is looking a little brighter in Europe than in other parts of the world, you know, this is a process and we need to see how this is going to evolve. What I'm going to say is that there are three things Europe needs to do, and by Europe I mean the European Union essentially, but also its member states and its societies. So there are three things that Europe needs to do, and that is address the economic recovery, address its own democratic failings, and look at its foreign policy. And I would say that these three issues, the approach needs to be three-dimensional. These three issues are deeply interconnected with each other. So let's start with the economic recovery. There's going to be a summit next week or in 2 weeks' time. They're going to try and thrash out a deal. And here there's several issues that need to be reconciled. On the one hand, well, first of all, we know the background to this. We know that the first weeks of the pandemic were chaotic and member states were divided. It was a pretty poor spectacle to the rest of the world. Then the EU managed to get their act together. And then there was a Franco-German proposal, which is quite a game changer, considering that the EU went through 10 years of dealing badly with the Eurozone crisis and demonstrating an inability and unwillingness to address the weaknesses behind the whole setup governing the euro. So it was quite a game changer. They're still haggling on the numbers, but in this haggle, what's emerging are a number of mini conflicts that underpin some of Europe's problems. The first is the so-called frugal four, so those countries that don't really want the countries that were deeply affected by the pandemic to receive much financial support. And of course, those who do want to, the European South that is in favor of a greater debt mutualization and a greater sharing of the burden. So that's one conflict. And then the other conflict is with the degree to which European funds should be tied to principles of democratic standards, right? So what's going to happen now that Angela Merkel is one of the proponents of this recovery fund? She's also proposed that it is embedded in the European Union's budget. So that means giving the Commission quite a big role. Again, this is quite a game-changing, potentially a game-changing proposal. But she's also, now that Germany has taken over the presidency of the European Union, she's also keen to reach a deal soon. And it's very important that these two dimensions are looked at the same time. The bringing back the European South to the center of European politics after a decade in which they were marginalized because of the impact of the Eurozone crisis, but at the same time addressing the democratic failings, which we see in another part of, mostly in another part of Europe, which is Hungary, Poland. I don't want to say these are not problems confined to Hungary and Poland, but in Hungary and Poland, the rule of law and democracy are being systematically dismantled by populism. And this will be it will be critical that these two dimensions are looked at, addressed at the same time. There's a third dimension, which is the foreign policy dimension. Can you hear me? Yeah, all right, because you kind of look perplexed. Right, so the third dimension is the foreign policy dimension. And I really want to bring this point home. The fact that over the past 10 years, populism has risen so much in the EU and has reached the European Council has undermined the ability for the EU to be united on the foreign policy front. But at the same time, the international context is not just hostile. I mean, it's actually hostile to the European integration project. It's not just an international context which is no longer benign. It's actually actively hostile. And China has been actively undermining European consensus by, for instance, the Belt and Road Initiative that was mentioned earlier, and looking at those peripheral countries that were worst affected by the crisis, looking at the soft belly of the EU, looking at Central and Eastern European countries where perhaps it is easier to undermine democratic processes. And it's been doing so deliberately. It's been sort of drawing circles around Europe. And of course, alongside these countries, we shouldn't forget that there are large countries which have large interests and in which China has large interests. So that includes Germany. So I don't want to say the Chinese question is a problem just for the smaller member states of the European Union. It's a problem for all of them. But this, the fact that populist leaders have introduced transactional politics inside the European Union has undermined the EU's ability to reach an agreement on all sorts of things. And we're watching this daily. And this is happening not just vis-a-vis distant issues and topics like Hong Kong, which could be seen as distant geographically. This is happening in Europe's neighborhood. It's happening in Serbia, where Chinese mask diplomacy was particularly aggressive. It's happening in Libya, where Turkey has been, Erdogan has been learning the lesson of Putin, that it's possible to sow disorder on the cheap, and has extended its influence in the Middle East and in North Africa, in areas where so far that presence was not at all quite as strong as it is now. So it has seriously undermined Europe's ability to carry out foreign policy. And of course, I've mentioned now issues and topics that are very much related to foreign policy piece, diplomacy, but this also accounts for global cooperation, multilateralism. If the EU member states are not divided, they're unable to play that leadership role in multilateral organizations. So it's hugely problematic. But at the same time, I also think that of all the actors that we're seeing around the world, Europe has a better chance. First of all, it has been responding far faster than one might have expected in light of the performance of the past 10 years. So it's been responding far faster than one would have expected on the coronavirus pandemic, both in economic terms, but also in international terms. If you look at the recovery package and multi-annual financial framework, the budget for foreign policy has been increased, not decreased. So you would have expected a sort of nation first attitude and a focus on public health domestically, but actually the foreign policy piece hasn't been forgotten. Admittedly, and this is something a lot of European nerds that I engage with are, dismayed about, the fund for defense has been cut, but not the foreign policy fund. So I think that's already a positive sign. Secondly, I think during this pandemic, in Europe and around the world, we saw plenty of examples in which civil society got mobilized and provided essential services to citizens, filled the gaps of state infrastructure. And I think that these kinds of examples have resonated quite strongly with civil society, certainly in Europe, I'm sure elsewhere as well, but I know Europe best. And I think they can form the basis for a new social contract, a new deal on how do we address global public goods, because essentially the coronavirus has brought out the fact that health is a global public good that knows no borders. So these examples demonstrate that there can be different ways of doing things, and these different ways of doing things need to be based on rethinking our democratic systems. And that's why the importance of the democratic piece, as I was mentioning earlier, rethinking our democratic systems and rethinking them in a multi-level way. And Europe is the best positioned for this because it's already deeply integrated at the supranational level. And it has pretty advanced local politics as well. Of all the EU member states that have been dealing with the coronavirus, Germany has been one of those that has dealt with it best, and it has federal health systems. Italy also has fairly federalized health systems, and you can see that there were local differences between one region and another. And therefore, the idea should be to look at what is it that works locally, that works locally, and that can provide an example and a best practice that can be applied elsewhere. But as I said, and I do want to reiterate this, if one thinks about reforming Europe and its institutions from taking a bottom-up perspective, better joining local politics and local democratic arrangements with the national ones and with the supranational ones agreed upon at the EU, that is also an interesting model globally, in the sense that it can be a model for an alliance of those countries, groups of people, civil society organizations, international organizations that want to work towards reforming multilateralism through global cooperation rather than through transactional politics. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. That was a really fantastic overview of the current situation and what the EU is doing and needs to do more. My perplexed face was looking at the stream of questions that were coming in from the audience, and I'd like to remind people that they can continue to submit some more. We have about half an hour for more questions, but we do actually have quite a lot of them already. Many of them are directed both to Martin and to Rosa. And so maybe I will go to Martin first, just to bring it back, but I'll pose several of them. You've touched on the topics already, but maybe Martin, you can have the first stab at this. Do you think countries like Hungary and Serbia that get murky financial deals from China can actually convince their citizens that the Chinese model is superior? There's another similar question. Hungary has had very few COVID cases, and it's also a very nationalistic country. Does this counter the narrative that populists and nationalists don't handle the pandemic effectively? And there's another question for Martin. Do you think China took advantage of the world's attention being elsewhere to enact the Hong Kong security law, and do you think it'll work? So that's a lot. There's definitely some questions for Sina too. We're gonna come back, but just to kind of keep these in a cluster here. Maybe we can start with that, and Martin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. So let me start with the last question first. So yes, I think there's certainly been an element of the the world's attention being focused on the health crisis in the decision by China to impose the state security law in Hong Kong. I think there have been other elements as well regarding the timing, the particular timing of imposing the law, like the situation in Taiwan, and in particular the presidential elections in Taiwan in January. I think the PRC had been holding off until Taiwanese voters made their decision known in the elections. And there were a few other elements as well. Now, will it have effect, right? Was that the question, or will it last? Will it succeed? Well, that's a cardinal question, of course, and in my opinion, it will do the job that the Chinese authorities expect it to do in the short term. There's a certain logic in running an oppressive regime. If you run an oppression, you need to go all the way, so to speak. So unfortunately, that's the way it works. And the more oppressive the laws are, of course, in the short term, the more intimidated the population is. So I'm afraid that in the short term, it will probably prove to be quite effective. In the long term, that's another question, because it will start a lot of processes with unforeseeable consequences, and it will also deepen some of the existing processes. Mainly, and I think that's going to be one of the major effects of this law. It will accelerate the breaking of the world into these two big blocks. We have already seen that in the resolutions that were tabled at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where I think it was 52 countries, mostly authoritarian countries, supported the security law, the security legislation, while 27 democracies opposed it. So we already see that the whole world community is sort of breaking into blocks alongside their relationship towards some of the activities of the People's Republic of China. Sorry, that was a rather long answer to a short question. So let me briefly go to the previous one about the efficiency of populist regimes, right? With obviously the health crisis. Well, they can be very efficient, because they can mobilize people. They can enforce rather draconian measures that would probably be very hard to implement in more open societies. And first and foremost, there's the case of China. And again, this is where the narrative breaks, right? This is how people see China's role in the pandemic differently, depending on whether they're focused on the origin of the crisis, where there's quite a bit of blame to go to China because of the way they handled the very beginning of the crisis, when they were trying to suppress information, did not inform both their own population and the world population at large. Or whether you focus on the measures that were taken by China in the second phase that were very radical, sometimes draconian, but also to a large extent efficient. So, there are certain structural advantages, of course, that the closed societies and the top-down regimes enjoy in dealing in emergency situations, but they also seem to tend to be the ones who allow these situations to arise to begin with. So sorry for the very long answers. I think that's probably all of me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, I wanted to see if Hans, maybe let's see how your internet connection is doing. Would you like to comment, because you also focus some of your remarks on this populist nationalist question? How are the populist nationalist regimes able to cope with this? Is this a sign that they are very capable governors, like in Hungary, for instance?
I'm not sure I know very much about Hungary. I don't speak Hungarian. I don't understand the culture. It's not a very big country. I have noticed that there's a governing that a lot of young people are leaving Hungary, which kind of means that some Hungarians at least, are not happy about the way the country's going. I don't know. I can't tell about Hungary. My impression is that in general, populists are not doing a very good job. Britain has done a worse job. Normally, if you say, where is governance poor in Europe, Italy or Britain, people would have always said in Italy. Italy always has collapsing governments and many prime ministers and a lot of corruption. Nothing works. But Italy was the first country in Europe to be confronted with this crisis. They had serious problems. They took decisive action. They mobilized society as a whole, and their numbers are actually looking better than Johnson's. You just have to look at it. I mean, Britain is having the worst pandemic in Europe, and nobody is praising the British government for particular efficiency at this point in time. If we look at the US, it's a complete disaster. The national administration has just given up, actually saying governors take care of this crisis. It's not a job. An interesting thing would be to consider India, which had a very radical lockdown and closed down the entire country, which turned out to be a disaster in a completely different way. Because suddenly they had 130 million internal migrants who had to return to their villages, but there were no more buses, there were no more trains, and people started to walk home, and it was a massive humanitarian disaster. And now they're opening up fast because it was a disaster, but it's quite obvious that the Indian government is, just as Sina said before, they're not taking care of their people. Returning to Hungary, if you have a country where but I can't comment on it in depth. The big question, what makes populists strong when they have an ideology that doesn't work? George Monbiot in The Guardian keeps writing that and I think he has a point, but there's an element of conspiracy theory that there's actually these anonymous offshore billionaires where sponsoring fake news. There was great interest in the investor class, people who have a lot of money to invest, to have free market and free trade because it gave them more access to markets. But now we're in a phase of globalization, where globalization is not just about opening markets, but re-regulating the global system. We need governments to embed the whole global system, which is what the EU is trying, not necessarily very successful. But people like Trump is the kind of billionaire who just simply does not like government. He wants to do, and he doesn't want to get anybody to get into the way. I think there's a lot of these billionaires. Peter Thiel, the Silicon Valley tycoon who supports Trump. Rupert Murdoch is one of them. George Soros is not. George Soros is one of the billionaires who's interested in some kind of cohesive order. There is this. I think her name's Bulgarian. She's in Copenhagen.
Sorry, Dr. Dembowski, it's again a bit quite difficult to understand you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut you off. This is my first Corona-era Zoom panel where I've had these technical difficulties. I've seen it happen, but it's hard for me to cut you off, but because I know what you're saying is. I wanted to ask Rosa as well about this. The battle of narratives between populist leaders versus democracies handling this well, and also about how difficult it has been or was in the early months of the crisis for the EU to kind of match the Chinese. You mentioned the mask diplomacy, but it's a real battle of narratives. And do you think that slowly the EU is able to reclaim the narrative as being best placed to cope with the crisis? And then we come to Sina to talk about sanctions a bit more. Thanks.
Thank you, Valerie. So in April, my colleagues at Carnegie dealing with democracy around the world looked at cases of democracies and authoritarian countries to see whether these were, whether it was possible to come to the conclusion that democracies do better. And I'm afraid we have good evidence on both sides. We have good evidence of democracies responding well, and we also have good evidence of authoritarian states responding well. This especially in Asia, and I guess one could also say in Hungary. And of course, in Hungary, Orban took advantage of this situation to concentrate even more powers in his hands. So what conversely the comparative research found was that what was really important in order to address the pandemic and the health crisis was trust and resilience of society. So those were kind of the more relevant criteria. But I'd also like to say something about populism and its performance. Now, maybe Trump will not be re-elected. This is the first time that the polls are signaling this. I wouldn't bet on it necessarily, but this is the first time this has happened. But I think that even if Biden were to win, Biden will have to have a hell of a job in addressing the reasons for which Trump was elected. And this is basically the point I want to make. Some populist leaders may get booted out because of their poor performance, but they still have a core base of true believers, and the reasons for which that true base of real believers exists is beyond coronavirus, and it's beyond policy performance. It's actually got to do with the state of democracy and advanced democracies. It has to do with the erosion of citizen trust in our institutions. It has a whole host of reasons, and therefore the root causes of the rise of populism will need to be addressed regardless of the electoral fortunes of individual leaders. But let me also say that I think from Trump's point of view, and certainly from Boris Johnson's point of view, I mean, I guess they were, because they don't believe in facts, they don't believe in science, and because they have very, very huge egos, maybe they were underestimating the impacts of the pandemic. But from their personal point of view, the political calculus probably was that it didn't matter. Johnson has a solid majority in Parliament, and he will be there for another 4.5 years. And by the time there'll be next elections, he was probably betting on the pandemic being over, possible, we don't know, but he will also have changed a whole set of things in the British system that will empower him and support his re-election in 4.5 years' time. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. And I think the calculus was also there for Trump. He probably maybe made the wrong calculus. And that's precisely the same calculus that Orban made. So you can have populist leaders come and go, but populism is there to stay. And if populist leaders have the time to fiddle around with their institutions, with their media and with their societies to undermine the democratic infrastructure, then they're going to be there to stay. How difficult will it be for Chinese mass diplomacy? I mean, a lot was said about that. I think that ultimately, I mean, Europe, okay, there are different levels. I mean, the first level, I think I can see I think Chinese mass diplomacy backfired. I think a lot of Europeans now are much more distrustful of Chinese-backed diplomacy. It was simply too aggressive. I think they overstepped their mark. So I wouldn't want to put too much emphasis on this communication side of things. The EU, yes, we know, is very poor at communicating. It's very poor at doing public diplomacy, and others have been much better. China, Russia, Turkey, etc., etc. We all know that, but I think beyond that, you really need to go to the substance and not just to the communication. So if Europe manages to push forward this recovery plan, and if Europe actually manages to be, to be of consequence on the decisions made, and if it manages to rejig the European economy in a way that citizens can notice, that will be more important than any Chinese mass diplomacy. The problem with China is the way in which its relations with Europe are interconnected on several fronts. So you have the investments, infrastructural investments, what percentage of Chinese investments form part of the European GDP. So look at Hungary, which is one of the countries that has been blocking the European Council on any Chinese statement with respect to China. Look how much of the GDP comes from China and how much of it comes from European structural funds. And that's where you've got your answers, right? that's where you got your answers. So let's talk substance and not just, follow the rhetoric and the aggressive diplomacy. And the other point, look at the opinion polls in the Balkans, Serbia in particular. So Serbia was another country that China targeted. So Serbs think that their economy is financed by Russian and Chinese money. But would they want to go and live in Russian China? No. So Europe still has soft, and in fact, Serbs are all going to Europe in search for a better future. And, there's a huge problem of emigration and demographic loss. A lot of young people are leaving the region. Europe still has that kind of soft power. China has sought soft power, but it's fake because it's actually driven by the Communist Party. It's not soft power; it is state-driven foreign policy. So I'm confident in that things can change. I'm confident that Europeans as a whole, not just the EU as an institution, but also the community of Europeans that makes the European Union, can reclaim the narrative. But they do need to work on being more united, on making sure that you don't have leaders who hedge against other EU member states for their domestic objectives, and that you have a common strategic vision where you weigh the challenges against each other and prioritize accordingly.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Now we have a set of questions for Sina. Actually, just wanted to keep the sort of discussions not going back and forth to so many different topics. But there are two basic questions for you, which is, if there were no sanctions against Iran, would the regime treat its people better? And would it have had a better result at containing COVID? And the second question is a follow on that. If the sanctions against Iran are inhumane, how would you suggest that Iran be held accountable for supporting international terrorism and for its aggressive acts? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. Well, these are both kind of questions that are very common, very mainstream. And the point of my article, the point of analysis that I provide was actually to counter this kind of simplistic and kind of, to be honest, dehumanizing kind of questions, because people in Iran are also humans. They don't have to suffer for the wrongs of their state, which they have no control over. So the idea that the sanctions have to be imposed and the people in Iran have to suffer because the Iranian state is a dictatorship and is waging war in the region, it doesn't make sense, because first of all, no one should pay the price for their state, what their state is doing, the same way that the American people should not be paying the price for what the Trump administration or Obama administration does. Iranian people are not responsible or accountable for what their state is doing, and they've been for decades trying to separate the state from the civil society. This is the struggle of people in the region, to separate civil society from these authoritarian dictatorship states, which means that the agency is in the hands of the people. The solutions are in the hand of the people. However, then the global narrative is set in a way that only the state has agency, only the state has representation in global level. But this is also changing with social media. Access to representation is changing. People's voice is being heard globally. So the state is no longer the sole representation of a given nation state. And the other question was, if the sanctions weren't imposed, how are we held accountable the Iranian state? And the question again goes back to the people. I mean, the entire argument that I'm trying to make is that we need to shift the focus of the discussion and the narrative away from the state and bring it to the populations, the civil society, popular democratic struggles, mass struggles, the revolutions that have been happening after the 2011 uprisings in the region are still ongoing. They're being crushed, they're being massacred, annihilated, mass arrests. The solution is these movements. The solutions are not in the hands of the foreign policy or the dictatorships, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Europe, that they impose with power and militaristic solutions, the solutions that are kind of large-scale, state-centered, patriarchal, top-down, hegemonic, dominating. These are not the answers. The answers are bottom-up, civil society-driven, decentralized, popular answers that people with their slogans are providing these answers. Even in Syria, after 10 years of bombardments, people are uprising again in regions held under the Assad regime. So this shows that the war sanctions are not the solution. War sanctions and state-centered narratives are not the solution. They're just going to create more suffering, more probably terrorism. All these things are coming from failed diplomatic relations in this, and the world needs to recognize the voices of the people underneath these states. That's it.
Thank you so much, Sina. I thought maybe to ask Rosa to respond to that from an EU policymaking perspective.
Sure.
What are the ways that that Brussels looks at this, or different European capitals look at how to have alternatives to sanctions?
Well, it's a shame that Brussels looks at this more than most European capitals. Brussels the EU has quite a long tradition of supporting civil society, human rights defenders around the world, and it's quite sadly ironic that it realized when democracy started deteriorating inside Europe that it had zero projects on supporting civil society within Europe for the protection of democracy and human rights. So I think there's quite a bit that can be learned. So let me just be a bit clearer first. The EU has quite a long history. It's one of the international actors that has mostly supported civil society human rights around the globe, but it has failed to connect that policy to its governmental policy. So you have interstate diplomacy, which is insufficiently connected to what the EU is actually doing on civil society front. And I think probably the Balkans is probably the best example of this, where you have frequent diplomatic meetings. The Balkans are very close. Some of the countries there are candidates to join the European Union, so they're going through negotiations. So you have this high-level talk, and then you have the EU spending actually quite a bit of money to support society there, but nonetheless, democracy has been deteriorating in many instances, and I would say Serbia perhaps is the most critical one at the moment. So it's very important not just to support societies, but also that support is backed by intergovernmental diplomacy. And that's where the real weakness has been on the European side. I don't think, because of that experience, I think there's plenty of scope to improve, but member states have been retreating from this. The democratic promotion agenda that the EU still embraces on paper, has fewer and fewer supporters, also because, as a consequence of the fact that not all the EU member states are perfectly democratic, and some are very imperfectly, in fact, some are undemocratic. But also because the global narrative has changed. The global narrative has moved very much in terms of geopolitical competition. We've got to be hard-nosed. We've got to speak the language of power. This is the High Representative recently. The Commission has stated that we need to be a geopolitical commission, because the way in which power relations have evolved recently has been very much concentrated around the state, and China has been a driver of this. The US has been a driver of this, but there are simultaneous dynamics, and those are the societal-led ones, the transnational-led ones, that remain there. They're still working. I mean, one of the reasons for which I can be optimistic is because I meet activists and I see how optimist they are about achieving something. Because if you look at it purely as an analyst, which is what I am, you tend to be rather pessimist, right? But there are people working on it, and we have examples. And I think that the most vivid example of the great success of civil society mobilization and cooperation with states and international organizations is the Paris Climate Agreement. And that momentum has been lost, but at the moment, but it hasn't disappeared, it's still there. And I think if we look at those examples, we can also think of different ways of addressing major conflicts between states, such as the confrontation between Iran and the US at the moment. And I also think it's where countries like the EU can find different sources of inspiration on how to do things, and also a new way to foster global cooperation. So it's really important to continue to emphasize this, even if it's become unfashionable to talk about civil society support, human rights support, democracy support. But that's, if we stop talking about it, that's giving into the language of the populists, of the toxic masculinity. It's really giving into that language. So it's important to keep that message going.
Thank you so much. We only have a few more minutes, and I wanted to hand it back to Hans and Martin to ask them the last question that we got from the audience, which is that the COVID crisis seems to promote scientists to work together, while political leaders have taken a more nationalist approach. Are scientists a sign of hope for global cooperation?
Should I start?
Sure. Hans still has his mic.
Well, I'm not sure that is an accurate description of what's happening, because we've seen a lot of competition in science around the coronavirus crisis, including hacking attacks on research institutions and even hospitals. So I think the competition probably goes across the board and doesn't only concern politicians but also scientists, unfortunately. So it's the sign of the time. We're just heading towards, as the Chinese say, more interesting times. Thanks.
Hans, can you? Yeah, there we go.
Well, I think that we need science. We need facts. As I said before,
sorry, I'm so sorry. I was really hoping that this time it was going to work. Can you just maybe adjust the microphone a bit closer to your face?
Yeah. I'm trying to move it around. Is this better?
That's good. Okay.
Okay.
Try
So my point is that we need global solutions to global problems. There are no national solutions to the climate crisis. There are no national solutions to world trade. There is no national solution to global financial stability. There is no national solution to world peace. We don't have a national solution for migration. These trends are strong. These trends are global. We need solutions that work. And it's fine to consider, what does a nation not like about the global rules? Great. How does a government feel restricted by global cooperation? Great. But what is the alternative they offer? We can go down the road of everybody putting their own nation first, which means we all lose. And I think that is an essential message that we have to get across. Nationalists do not offer solutions that work.
Thank you. That was a very succinct and fine place to end. I'd like to thank you all for being here and thank the Lemkin reunion for inviting me. And I just want to hand it back to Ben to make a few concluding remarks. Thanks very much for such an interesting panel.
So thank you all so much for your participation. And I'll take this opportunity to not only thank this panel, but thank every panel that we had. We've had 5, I think, stellar presentations over the last 3 days. And I'm thrilled that we were able to do this. So again, thanks everyone who participated. Thank you to the audience who stayed and watched and gave us such outstanding questions. And this concludes the 6th Lemkin reunion. And I'm certainly going to tune in for the 7th. So I hope I'll see all of you there. And thanks again to the Shaftok Center team, Kirsten Roberts-Lear, Al-Hakam Shah, Adnan Saman, Karen Culver, and to Daniel Zimani, who's been our director for every broadcast. Thank you very much. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.